We were both asleep in bed when suddenly she sat up and screamed, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." I checked to see if she was okay, but her eyes were closed. She was still sleeping. I'm Tom Stewart, and this is My Paranormal Story. Before I start this episode, I just want to thank you for listening. Remember, if you've bought t-shirts or coffee mugs from my website, myparanormalstory.com, be sure to send me a selfie with your swag so I can post it on Facebook or Instagram. And don't forget, everything you buy on the website helps keep this podcast running. So thank you so much for your support. Somniloquy. That's the technical term for talking in your sleep. Just about everyone does it now and then, but there isn't always someone there to hear you. When your body is in a deep sleep and your brain is conjuring up dreams, sometimes you might speak out loud some of the words that you might be saying in those dreams. I mean, most of the time, if someone does hear you talking in your sleep, they probably won't even know what you said. It'll probably sound more like a mumble or just a few random words that make no sense. We tend to find it amusing when we hear someone talking in their sleep, hoping maybe that sleeping person will confess something to us or blurt out a secret. But scientists say, in most cases, it's just overactive brain waves during the REM stage. For some people, it's considered a sleeping disorder, brought on by medical reasons like depression or anxiety, and it can also be caused by drugs or alcohol use. And in some cases, it can be associated with sleep apnea or even night terrors. But not everyone believes talking in your sleep is a natural occurrence. There are many cultures who believe talking in your sleep is your subconscious mind trying to communicate, like you're trying to tell yourself something. Other people believe it actually is you speaking, but from another dimension. There have also been, and probably still are, some religions who believe talking in your sleep is actually spirits trying to communicate through you, or perhaps the devil himself. There have been many cases where people who spoke in their sleep were considered to be possessed. If you live with someone who talks in their sleep, you probably find yourself trying to listen, trying to figure out what it is they're saying. And that's what happened to me. Several years ago, I was in a relationship with an ex-girlfriend. I don't want to use her real name, so let's call her Missy. Missy and I had been dating for a while, and she had just moved into a new apartment in Providence, Rhode Island. Once or twice a week, I would stay overnight at her new apartment. Some nights she would stay at mine. But what was strange was, when she would sleep at my place, she never made a peep. But when I would sleep over her apartment, quite often I would hear her talking in her sleep. Her apartment was located in a big old house. It had 2 floors and had been recently remodeled into several small apartments, 2 on the first floor and 2 on the second floor. Everything in the house was big. The doors, the windows, the staircases, even the ceilings were super tall. And it looked like a mansion you'd see in a murder mystery movie. It wouldn't have surprised me at all if the house had secret doors behind bookcases or something. Now, Missy's apartment was on the second floor, in the back. And she had her own private entrance in the back parking lot with a set of wooden stairs that led up to a small deck outside her back door. The apartment was small, but big enough for one person. She had a good-sized kitchen, a living room, and a bedroom. The hardwood floors looked original, but had definitely been refurbished. And the modern cabinets and appliances in the kitchen all looked out of place against the older-looking walls. You could easily tell that this old house had been turned into a modern apartment building. Her neighbors all seemed to be pretty quiet, or at least the old thick walls made them seem that way. Occasionally you'd hear someone come in the main front door, but only because it was such a big, heavy door, and it would shake the whole house when someone closed it. But other than that, it was a pretty quiet and comfortable home. Sometimes we would go out on a date and end up back at her place. Or other times we would just stay in, cook dinner, and watch movies. And on some of those occasions, I would spend the night. Missy would always fall asleep before me, though. She had to be up early for work on most mornings, and at the time, I worked later hours and was a bit of a night owl. So as she would be sleeping next to me in her bed, I'd be watching TV or reading. The first few times I'd slept over, I didn't hear or notice anything. But then one night, as I was laying next to her reading a book, she mumbled something to me. I couldn't quite hear what she said. It sounded like she was half asleep trying to ask me something. But her eyes were still shut, and I could tell that she was sleeping, so I just ignored it. But then a few minutes later, she mumbled again, a little louder. But again, I couldn't make out what she said. But it was different from what she said the first time. I leaned in to see if I could hear her a little better, but she never spoke again. The next day I told her that she was talking in her sleep, but she didn't believe me. And I teased her and told her she kept calling out some other guy's name, just being playful, but she knew I was just kidding around. A couple of weeks later, it happened again. I was lying in bed next to her, just starting to fall asleep, when I heard her say something. I don't know if she was mumbling or if I was just too sleepy to understand her. So I closed my eyes and started to drift off to sleep. But suddenly, she spoke again. "Open the door!" I could hear her clearly this time, and thought she was awake. So I looked up and said, "The door is open," thinking maybe she was talking about the bedroom door. But she didn't say anything back to me. Her eyes were closed, and she was fast asleep. The next morning I told her about her saying, "Open the door," but she didn't remember saying anything. She did remember having a lot of strange dreams that night, though. Bad dreams, too. She couldn't remember what they were about specifically, just that she remembers them being scary. It was probably a week or so later that it happened again. We were both asleep in bed, and all of a sudden, Missy sat up and yelled out, "I can't breathe! I can't breathe!" And I jumped up in a panic. "What do you mean you can't breathe? Are you okay?" And I looked at her, and she was sitting up with her eyes closed. She was still fast asleep. But again, I asked, "Are you okay?" And I shook her, just to make sure she was fine. And she woke up and was like, "Why are you waking me?" I told her, "You're talking in your sleep again. You were saying that you couldn't breathe?" She just looked at me strange, as if I was the one having this dream. She turned over and went back to sleep, and eventually I settled down and was able to get to sleep too, but not before deciding to do something about this. The next day, I went to the store and bought a small audio recorder, something I could use to tape her talking in her sleep. She was against it at first. She thought it'd be kind of creepy to be hearing the things she's saying in her sleep. But I convinced her to let me do it and promised that I wouldn't force her to listen to any of it. After about 3 attempts and hours of audio, I really couldn't find any recordings of her talking in her sleep. It made me almost want to just give up on the idea. But then one night I was laying next to her in bed, watching TV. She was asleep. But I heard her mumble something. So I quickly pressed record on the recorder.
Help me, Jesus, help me, I can't do it.
I couldn't really make it out until I listened to it a few times the next day. And it was strange. It was probably just another scary dream? I continued to make these recordings whenever I would sleep over, and to be honest, I was starting to become obsessed with it. But I felt like there was more to her sleep talking. Most nights it would just be strange mumbles, but every once in a while, I'd be able to make out the words. They'd mostly be random words like water or truck, nothing that ever made sense. I wasn't sure what was more creepy, her talking in her sleep, or me wanting to listen to it over and over again. But then one night, things got really creepy. I was lying next to her in bed, quietly reading a book, when she started to speak again. She kept saying, "Mommy, Mommy," over and over again, like a few times in a row. It was like she was crying out for her mother. Except this time, it wasn't her voice. It sounded like a little girl's voice, but it was definitely coming from her mouth. I thought to myself, maybe she's dreaming about when she was a little girl. From this point on, Missy's sleep talking got stranger and stranger. Many of the things she was saying, at least the ones I could understand, were all sounding like cries for help. Sometimes it would just be a simple voice looking for assistance. Other times it sounded like a person in grave danger. And the weird thing was, they weren't all her voice. Sometimes she'd sound like a little kid. Other times she'd sound like an adult, but in a voice different from hers. Missy and I broke up and went our separate ways. She moved on, got married, and lives in New Hampshire, I think now. But a few years ago, a couple of friends of mine from a local paranormal investigation team were heading out on a case, and knowing that I had some years of experience investigating, asked me if I wanted to tag along. So they told me the address, and I didn't even realize where I was going until I pulled up in front of the old big house. So I started to tell the members of the group about my experiences with Missy, and that's when it all started to make sense. The historian of the group told me that the reason they think there's activity in the house is because for 60 years or so, before it became an apartment complex, the house was a funeral home. My Paranormal Story is written, produced, and narrated by me, Tom Stewart. Music from this episode courtesy of Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com. If you enjoy my stories and would like to support the podcast, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/myparanormal or just click on the donate button on my website at myparanormalstory.com. I also have t-shirts and coffee mugs for sale. Unfortunately, podcasts cost money, and your support helps me keep this podcast running. So thank you for your support. Please don't forget to subscribe so you'll know when I've added new episodes, and feel free to follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Just search for My Paranormal Story. If you have a podcast and you'd like to have me as a guest, or if you would like to ask me a question or tell me your paranormal story, you can email me at myparanormalstorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. I'm Tom Stewart, and this is My Paranormal Story.